Well, Jack finally joined the king's army. First he fought in one war, then he fought in another, and after he'd served about 30 years or so, they reckoned he'd done pulled his term and they gave him his discharge. Now, back in them days, whenever they discharged a man from the army, they didn't give him no pay or anything. All they gave him was 2 loaves of bread. So there was Jack, walking down the road with them 2 loaves of bread under his arm, when he came across a beggar man that asked him for something to eat. So Jack gave him one of his loaves of bread and went on down the road. After he had walked a bit further, he came across an old man that asked Jack for something to eat. So Jack took his other loaf of bread, broke it in half, and gave that man half of it. But before he'd went too far, he started to think about that and went back to that man and said, "Daddy, I didn't treat you right. I gave another man a whole loaf, and I didn't give you but half of one. Here's the rest of the loaf." "Well now, Jack, you're all right, and here's something I'm going to give you." The man had a sack over his arm. He got that and told Jack, "Now, Jack, if there's ever anything that you want to catch, you just hold this sack open and clap your hands together and say, 'Wickety-whack,' into this sack, and it'll get right in this sack for you." The man handed Jack the sack. Then he pulled out a glass out of his pocket. He showed that to Jack and said, "Now, Jack, if you ever know somebody that's sick and you want to know whether they'll die or get better, you just take this glass and fill it up with clear spring water and look through it. And if death is standing at the head of the bed, that person's going to die. But if death is standing at the foot of the bed, that person will get better." Jack thanked the man for the gifts and went on his way. He went on back home. Wasn't too long after that word came down in the town where Jack was at that the king's girl was down sick and everybody was looking for her to die. All the best doctors said that she couldn't be cured, but the king wouldn't hear anything of it and had all the doctors' heads cut off. Then the king sent out word that anybody could cure his daughter would be paid several $1,000s. Well, Jack, he didn't want the money, but he did want to see that girl get better. So he got his sack and his glass and went on to the king's house. The king showed Jack where his daughter was at, and Jack sent for some clear spring water. When he got it, Jack filled up that glass and looked through it toward the daughter. And there was death, standing at the head of the bed, a-grinning. Well, Jack set down his glass, picked up his sack, held it open, and said, "Wickety-whack, into my sack." And death got down into Jack's sack. Well, Jack tied it up real good, and the king's girl got better. The king tried to pay Jack, but Jack wouldn't take any money. Jack just took his sack on home and had it tied in a poplar tree in the front yard. Well, Jack kept on with his house. He'd hire some boys to help him take care of his house. They'd grow up and get married, move off. Jack would hire some more. He noticed his hair was graying up considerable. His beard was getting sort of long. But Jack never paid any attention to that. He enjoyed life. Never paid much attention to the almanac either. He did keep a calendar to see when it was Sunday and not to work, but he never did notice what year it was. Then one day, Jack decided he'd go into town and meet with some old friends. So he started walking into town, and the first person he saw was an old woman. She was bent over so her knees almost hit her nose when she walked. Her gray hair was so thin it was almost gone. Her skin was so leathery and wrinkly it was almost terrible to look at. Her eyes were sunk way back in her head. Jack went over to her and said, "Howdy do, ma'am." When she heard Jack, she started straightening up. Her shaking like palsy. Then she got up to where she could look at Jack. "Howdy do, son." "Howdy do, ma'am. How you getting on?" "Oh, Law, it's awful." "Why, what's the matter, Granny?" "Living as long as this, that's what." "Yeah, I did notice you was getting a little old like. Just how old are you, ma'am?" "Next June, on the 12th day of the month, I'll be 206 years old." "My, that is a long time for somebody to be a-living." "It ain't right, living this long and not being able to die." "You mean you want to die?" "Oh, Lord, yes." "Well, why can't you die, Granny?" "Ain't you heard? Some fools got death shut up in a sack, and there ain't nobody died around here for 142 years. Jack turned around right there and went on back home. He studied on what the old woman had said for a day or two. Then he called one of his boys to get the sack out of the poplar tree. Jack cut it open where he had tied it, and once Death got out, all the old folks started dropping dead wherever they were. And Jack was about the first one Death got, I reckon.